At 76, Jessica Lange has finally spoken out about the things she once kept hidden behind the scenes of Tootsie. 5 names, 5 colleagues who helped create a legendary film yet left her with emotions too complex to put into words. This is not an attack or a grudge, but rather memories laced with regret, sadness, and the quiet reflections of an artist who has nearly completed her journey. And perhaps it's that very sense of lateness that makes the story all the more haunting. Dustin Hoffman. The name Jessica Lange can never forget from Tootsie. Dustin was never rude or aggressive. Quite the opposite, he was funny, charming, able to make the whole crew laugh. And that, paradoxically, made it even harder for Jessica to voice her frustration. To say anything risked being labeled overly sensitive or worse, ungrateful toward a Hollywood giant. So she smiled, carried on, and buried her true feelings deep inside. There was no explosion, no dramatic clash, no public accusations. Instead, it was a series of small cuts, being interrupted while speaking to the director, a careless joke before an important take, a look that seemed to say, "I know better than you what you should do." Over time, those small cuts became a scar not visible to the world, but etched into her memory. Years later, when asked about her most difficult colleagues, Jessica no longer hesitated to name Dustin, not to diminish him, nor to stir old resentments, but simply to tell the truth, that behind the brilliance of a classic film were moments when she felt overshadowed, pressed beneath someone else's dominance. Naming him was not an accusation, it was a way of freeing herself from a weight she had carried for decades. For audiences, Dustin Hoffman remains a shining star. For Jessica Lange, he is a far more complicated memory, one she only dared to share when she was old enough no longer to fear the judgment of others. In the eyes of the public, Dustin Hoffman has long been considered a cinematic icon. His acting style is deep, versatile, and endlessly captivating, as if he were born to be an artist. With his role as Michael Dorsey in Tootsie, Dustin not only left a lasting impression on audiences, but also cemented his position as one of the greatest actors of his generation. To viewers, it was a dazzling success. But behind the scenes, for Jessica Lange, the days working alongside Dustin left behind a lingering scar, one of discomfort, of being overshadowed, and at times quietly dismissed. Jessica never denied Dustin's talent. On the contrary, she has often admitted that his brilliance helped elevate the film. Yet that very brilliance came with a habit she could never feel at ease with: his need to control everything. On set, Dustin often acted like a shadow director. He wasn't just focused on his own performance but frequently interrupted lines, adjusted blocking, and even commented on the gaze of his co-stars. At times, when Jessica was preparing to sink into character, he would lean in, offering suggestions that sounded kind, but left her feeling like a student being tutored, not an Oscar-winning actress in her own right. To the outside world, Dustin Hoffman was witty, sharp, and delightfully eccentric. But to Jessica, every interruption or correction felt like her artistic freedom was being chipped away. "He treated me as if I needed him to know how to act," she once confided in a private conversation. The words weren't spoken with explosive anger, but with quiet sadness, the sadness of an artist yearning for respect. What bothered Jessica most wasn't the overt control, but how Dustin cloaked it in politeness. He could correct her lines while smiling, praising, "You're doing great, but try it this way." To others, it seemed like teamwork, generosity. To Jessica, it was a subtle dismissal, a polite erasure of her voice. One memory she never forgot was filming the famous bar scene, when their characters slowly drew closer. It was a moment Jessica believed needed only stillness and quiet nuance. But just before shooting, Dustin offered a stream of suggestions: how she should smile, how to lift her glass, where exactly her eyes should land. She nodded, silent, and complied, knowing that resistance might sour the atmosphere. The scene turned out beautiful on screen, adored by audiences. But for Jessica, it carried a bitter aftertaste. It was no longer hers alone, but a moment commandeered by her co-star. Teri Garr, the colleague who left Jessica Lange with a quiet sadness in Tootsie. Later in life, when reflecting on colleagues who had unsettled her, Jessica named Teri, not out of malice, not out of resentment. She respected her deeply, even grateful for how Teri's presence had enriched Tootsie. But she also needed to speak her truth, that behind the collective glow of a classic film was a Jessica who once endured nights of wondering whether she was enough or whether she was destined to be seen only in comparison. Today, audiences still recall Teri Garr with warmth and affection. Jessica does not dispute that. She only wishes they'd remember that alongside Teri's radiance was a Jessica who bore the weight of silent comparisons, endured harsh gazes, and carried that quiet sadness until she was finally old enough to give it a voice. If Dustin Hoffman was the towering presence, always casting his shadow with an urge to control, then Teri Garr was something else entirely. For Jessica Lange, Teri was never imposing, nor someone who sought to dominate the set. Yet her presence brought with it a quiet sadness, the sadness of comparison, of whispered chatter behind the scenes, and of being placed side by side so others could decide who truly shined brighter. To audiences, Teri Garr was the embodiment of charm, radiant, witty, and effortlessly funny. She had the gift of turning tension into laughter. In Tootsie, she played Sandy, the best friend of the main character, a supporting role, yet so memorable that viewers often left the theater still talking about her. But that very memorability was what left Jessica feeling unsettled. In Hollywood, women had always been scrutinized more harshly than men. It wasn't just about performance, but beauty, allure, and even the way one smiled. On the set of Tootsie, Teri's presence often felt like a mirror, forcing Jessica into comparisons she never asked for. Who's more captivating? Who acts more naturally? Who fits better with Dustin? Harmless questions to some, but Jessica heard them all, and they lingered. What hurt wasn't rivalry from Teri because there was none. Teri was warm, kind, always lightening the mood. But that very ease sometimes created distance. When Teri laughed, the crew laughed with her. When she told a joke, every eye turned her way. Jessica would smile politely, glass in hand, but deep inside, she felt an emptiness. Not out of jealousy, but from realizing she was slowly being eclipsed in an unspoken game of attention, a game no one admitted to playing, but one everyone was caught inside. Once, after a scene, director Sydney Pollack praised Teri for her effortless grace. To Jessica, those words stung like a pinprick. Beneath the compliment lay an unspoken comparison. Perhaps Jessica's performance wasn't quite as natural. Though Sydney meant no harm, the remark left her wounded. As an Oscar-winning actress, Jessica knew her worth. But on a set confined by egos and fragile dynamics, such casual comments cut deeper than any official critique. Unlike Dustin, who imposed himself, Teri represented another kind of pressure. The pressure of comparison, of hushed remarks in corridors, of glances that made her feel smaller. The hardest part was that Jessica couldn't fault Teri. She had done nothing wrong. She was simply being herself, graceful, beloved, effortlessly engaging. And sometimes, that natural ease left Jessica feeling out of place. One memory remained vivid: the wrap party. The room buzzed with laughter as Teri stood in the center, retelling a funny story about a botched take. Everyone roared. Jessica, sitting quietly with her wine, smiled along but felt the heaviness in her chest. She asked herself, will anyone remember what I brought to this film, or will they only remember Teri? No one could answer, yet the question followed her for years. Dabney Coleman, the colleague who made Jessica Lange realize that cinema could be as cold as a contract. Hollywood had plenty of Dabney Coleman's actors who were dependable, punctual, flawless in execution. Audiences admired them for their consistency and skill. But for artists like Jessica, professionalism alone wasn't enough. She longed for resonance, for that shared heartbeat between co-stars, the belief that together they were creating something greater than themselves. That Dabney never offered. Years later, Jessica never denied his importance to Tootsie. His Ron Carlyle gave the film much of its bite, making audiences squirm with dislike, yet unable to look away. But in her heart, Dabney remained a symbol of a harsher truth, that not everyone in cinema views it as a soulful journey. For some, it is simply a job, a deal to be completed. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled her. Not insult, not hostility, but the sense of being abandoned in a space where she had hoped for communion. His polite detachment left wounds deeper than any harsh word could, because it reminded her that not all colleagues were truly in the same boat, even as they stood side by side on set. At 76, Jessica finally named Dabney among the 5 colleagues who had left her with difficult memories. Not to diminish him, she fully acknowledged his professionalism. But she wanted to tell the truth, that sometimes professionalism without passion suffocates the heart of an artist. By speaking out, Jessica wasn't condemning him, but reminding future generations that behind every classic film lie moments of loneliness, when those around you are not beating to the same rhythm of feeling. Among the names that contributed to the success of Tootsie, Dabney Coleman may not be the most celebrated. He wasn't the dazzling star that Dustin Hoffman was, nor did he radiate the effortless charm of Teri Garr. But for Jessica Lange, Dabney left a lasting impression of another kind. He was the man who treated filmmaking like a business deal, where everything was measured by advantage, status, and a certain cold-blooded pragmatism. In Hollywood, Dabney had built his reputation playing charming villains, powerful men, slightly arrogant, both despicable and unforgettable. Yet what unsettled Jessica wasn't his role on screen, but how much of that villain energy bled into real life, into every conversation and every moment behind the scenes. On set, Jessica craved artistic connection, a space where actors could listen to one another, breathe life into their characters together. But for Dabney, everything seemed stripped down to function. Arrive, act, finish the job, collect the paycheck, and leave. His professionalism bordered on detachment. He rarely spoke about his character, seldom shared feelings, and never exposed any artistic struggle. For him, the script was the script, the dialogue, the role, a task to be completed, nothing more, nothing less. For Jessica, it was disheartening. She believed cinema was not just a job but a living art form, a way of giving life and soul to stories. But whenever she tried to engage with Dabney, his replies were curt, sometimes laced with sarcasm. "All we need is to make the audience laugh. That's enough," he once remarked during a discussion. To Jessica, those words felt as cold as a legal clause. They cut through all the emotion she held sacred in her craft. The irony was that Dabney wasn't rude. He didn't bark orders or impose himself like Dustin. On the contrary, he was polite, efficient, even humorous at times. But beneath the charm was an unmistakable distance, the gap between someone who saw film as art and someone who saw it as work. For Jessica, that gap was more painful than overt domination, because it left her feeling like she was pouring her heart into scenes alongside someone who was only present with technique, not with soul. One memory still burned in Jessica's mind, the filming of a heated argument between her character and Dabney's, Ron Carlyle, the sharp-tongued TV director. It was a pivotal scene meant to spark real tension. Jessica gave everything: her eyes, her voice, her body charged with emotion. When the director called cut, Dabney simply shrugged and said, "Fine, enough for the audience to get it." No praise, no reflection, no sense that they had just created something alive together. To Jessica, it was like throwing her heart into a performance, only to have it ricochet off a cold wall. Charles Durning. The overwhelming friendliness that left Jessica Lange breathless in Tootsie. Jessica never lashed out. She thanked him after every bit of advice, smiled through every long story, but inside, she sighed often. "He made me feel like I always had to keep my door open, even when I just wanted to close it for a moment and breathe," she once confided to a friend. It was not anger, just a quiet sadness, because she knew Charles only meant well. For audiences, Charles Durning remains forever the gentleman who brought humor and compassion to the screen. For Jessica, he was both a vital part of Tootsie's success and a reminder of a lesser-spoken truth. Even kindness, without boundaries, can weigh heavy. And sometimes, a hug held too tightly even when born of love can make the one embraced feel they cannot breathe. Among the names tied to Tootsie, Charles Durning is remembered not only for his acting talent, but also for the image of a warm, funny, deeply affectionate man. He played Leslie, the honest, small-town widower who falls for Jessica Lange's character. On screen, that unrequited love gave the film moments both tender and bittersweet, stirring sympathy for both characters. Off-screen, Charles carried much of the same energy. Friendly, open, always ready to share stories and affection. But for Jessica Lange, that very warmth sometimes became suffocating, like an embrace held just a little too tightly, leaving no room to breathe. The crew adored Charles for his down-to-earth kindness. He often told jokes, checked in on everyone from the lighting tech to the makeup artist. To him, a film set was like a temporary family. Everyone deserved attention, a laugh, a little care. And with Jessica, his attention was even stronger, given that, on screen, the two were paired in a meant-to-be but never-to-be relationship. He often pulled her aside, whispering old memories, childhood stories, career struggles, bittersweet anecdotes. At first, these moments touched Jessica. Sometimes they even moved her to tears. But the sheer length, frequency, and intensity of his sharing gradually drained her. The hardest part for Jessica was this: Charles never did anything wrong. He wasn't rude, sharp, or overbearing. He was simply too much. Too much attention, too much advice, too much intimacy, even when she needed space. While Jessica sought quiet moments to center herself, Charles would appear, hand on her shoulder, offering encouragement or yet another funny tale to help her relax. What he meant as kindness, she sometimes felt as an intrusion. One memory still stood out to her years later. They were about to shoot a pivotal farm scene where Charles's character confesses his feelings. It demanded subtlety. Jessica's character had to look torn between discomfort and compassion. Just before the cameras rolled, Charles launched into a half-hour monologue about his own experiences with unrequited love, hoping to give her inspiration. Jessica smiled politely, nodded, but inside, she only longed for silence to find her own truth. The scene came out beautifully, and audiences praised their natural chemistry. But for Jessica, what lingered wasn't artistic triumph, but the sense of her inner space being crowded out. Charles had a huge heart, and that generosity won him love everywhere he went. Yet, to Jessica, at times that same generosity cast a shadow. She felt like a guest in Charles's house of affection. Welcome, yes, but never left alone. It wasn't his fault, nor was it selfishness. It was simply the clash of two natures, one overflowing with warmth, the other needing solitude. Bill Murray, the wrong-timed laughter that left Jessica Lange exhausted. Years later, in her twilight years, Jessica still remembered Bill with mixed feelings. She acknowledged his rare brilliance, that his presence gave the film its buoyancy. But she was also candid. Bill Murray was among the colleagues who frustrated her most. Not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but because he believed so fiercely in laughter that he forgot. Sometimes, silence and listening are the greatest gifts. In her journey, Jessica met all kinds of people, severe, competitive, cold, overly warm. With Bill, she faced yet another kind, boundless humor. It was both light and shadow. It brought laughter to the world, yet left a quiet scratch upon her heart. And perhaps that is the paradox of acting itself. What audiences cherish most in a star may be the very thing their colleagues quietly endure. If Dustin Hoffman was remembered for his severity, Teri Garr for her competitiveness, Dabney Coleman for his coldness, and Charles Durning for his overwhelming warmth, then Bill Murray stood at the complete opposite extreme, endless humor. No matter where or when, Bill could drop a witty line that made the entire crew erupt in laughter. For audiences, he was the spirit of levity in Tootsie, easing the film's tension. But for Jessica Lange, his humor sometimes felt like a double-edged sword, turning moments that demanded reverence into noisy punchlines, leaving her feeling unheard. Bill Murray was famous for his improv style, constantly improvising on set. He loved to add lines, twist scenes, or tease his co-stars to spark spontaneous reactions. To many, it was genius. To Jessica, it was often draining. When she needed to dive deep into a scene's raw emotions, Bill might suddenly throw in an unscripted joke. The crew's laughter would erupt, but Jessica's carefully built emotions collapsed in an instant. Once, during a tense scene between Jessica and Dustin, Bill lingered nearby. Just as the moment found its perfect rhythm, he blurted out a sharp quip. The set burst out laughing, the cameras stopped rolling, and the atmosphere shattered. Jessica forced a smile, but inside she wanted to scream, "This is not the time to joke." The difficult truth was, Bill meant no harm. He truly believed laughter cured everything: stress, fatigue, even loneliness. But for Jessica, sometimes what she needed wasn't laughter, but seriousness. She once confided that acting wasn't just reciting lines, it was reaching into the soul of a character. To do that, she needed quiet and respect. Bill, with his carefree spirit, often broke that fragile space without realizing it. Outside the set, Bill's antics never slowed. He cracked jokes in the makeup chair, improvised at the dinner table, even turned private conversations into comedy skits. Sometimes Jessica longed to speak honestly about the pressure she felt, or her fears about carrying a major role. Yet before she could finish, Bill would twist her words into parody, triggering laughter all around. For others, it was a relief from long workdays. For Jessica, it felt like dismissal, her sincerity erased. Her emotions turned into entertainment. One night, after shooting, the cast gathered for dinner. Jessica opened up about her anxiety over the film's final scene, the heartbreak her character must face. She hoped for empathy. Instead, Bill slipped into a mock tremble, imitating her tone, pretending to sob. The table roared. Jessica laughed too, not wanting to sour the mood, but inside, sadness quietly swelled. "I felt like I'd been turned into a character in his comedy act, even when I was being completely serious," she later admitted. Today's story isn't meant to reopen old grudges or stir up noise. It's simply the late-life reflections of Jessica Lange. Behind the bright lights of cinema, every artist carries private burdens, sometimes only finding the courage to speak them in their twilight years. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you felt a connection or have your own memories of Tootsie, please share them in the comments below. We look forward to seeing you again in the next story.